FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome, and you are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz, and today is March 6th, 2018. Hey, as always, join the show, be a part of it. I'm going to start reading your emails on air and answering them. In the meantime, there's an economic issue that you're probably aware of, but not aware of how impactful it can be upon your personal finances. That is, unless you live in the People's Republic of California. And with that, I am referring to so-called climate change. And person you're about to hear from is Marc Morano. Marc, you run climatedepot.com. You just come out with another new book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. And we're thrilled to have you on the show.
Thank you, Kerry. Happy to be here today. Appreciate it.
All right. So looking at your book, which just came out the past few days, obviously you are a climate change skeptic. I mean, don't you care about the polar bears?
Yeah, that's one of the things. In fact, I spent a whole chapter on that in the book. Polar bears, just to start with, are at or near historic population highs. They're absolutely thriving, but yet the climate activists will tell you it's worse than we thought. It's dire. How could they make such a claim? Because they defy current reality. They ignore current reality, and they now have their predictions of 2050, 2075 are much scarier than they were just a few years ago. Thus, it's worse than we thought, defying all the current knowledge. And in the book, I also detail how polar bears have survived many other warm periods, much warmer than they're even contemplating now, and have survived as a species. So the polar bear, if that's going to be your poster child for global warming, there's some serious problems there because you have an overcrowding situation going on.
You mean there's a population explosion among polar bears,
Absolutely.
And they're going to be fighting each other?
At or near record highs. And even the Inuit, the indigenous people of Canada, will tell you frankly, and they're quoted in the book, they don't see any polar bear problem at all, and they go back, with their ancestors and everything. If anything, they put a hunting ban on the polar bears in the late 1960s, 1970s, and that has been phenomenally healthy for the species because people used to go up there for trophy hunting, and I guess they overhunted the species. And because of that ban, their numbers have thrived, and there's been no negative impact from any alleged warming of the Arctic. And by the way, in the book, I point out that the Arctic monitoring of the sea ice began in the 1970s. What else was going on in the 1970s? The global cooling ice age scare. So they started monitoring the Arctic ice in the 1970s when it was at its coldest period in probably 40 years. So yes, I will admit we have warmed in the Arctic since the global cooling ice age scare of the 1970s.
All right, so you mean those pictures of the polar bear floating around the Arctic and a block of ice looking helpless, maybe that's out of context?
Well, not only, yes, what they've done, in fact, there's been a couple instances where they've gotten a dying or sick polar bear, and they've tried to make it in recent years, and they've tried to make them the poster child of global warming. Well, if anything, overpopulation can create some underweight polar bears, and that would more likely explain it. But as a species and as a whole, of all the populations and subpopulations in Canada and throughout the Arctic, the Russian Arctic, they are doing well, and there is absolutely no indication that global warming, in fact, I quote polar bear biologists up in Canada and other experts, they're just not being affected. And you can say, oh, XYZ may happen in the future, but if you look to the past, they've survived much worse than it's even being predicted by the most dire scenarios.
Wow. Who would have thunk this was possible if climate change is such a threat to your life and mine, and of course the poor polar bears? What's a global warmist to do?
Well, what they do, again, they try to say it's worse. They do the scare scenario of predictions, and they do this across the board. Sea level, not only has it decelerated recently, Kerry, but it's actually paused according to NASA data. So what do you do with sea? How do you divert attention from the fact that sea level, not only is it slowing down the rise, and it's been rising, by the way, for 10,000 plus years since the end of the last ice age, but how do you divert attention away from that reality? Well, you make a scary prediction. Sea level, and our new projection so that sea level could now swamp instead of half of Florida, 3/4 of Florida. They come up with all these new dire scenarios of literally sometimes hundreds of years from now. And that's the way they can divert attention from current reality. And in the case of, say, California drought or the hurricanes, they try to just focus in and say, oh my gosh, this is a horrible job. This is unprecedented. But then they're not unprecedented. I spent a lot of time in the book on extreme weather claims. For instance, California drought. California had droughts many, many times worse in previous centuries, back 2 centuries. The 20th century into the 21st century has been a time of relative calm. All of these wildfires we hear about in California in the 19th century were dramatically higher wildfires, back before the age of global warming. Tornadoes. I show in the book that tornadoes, yes, Al Gore can correctly claim there's more tornadoes than ever before, but that's because we can detect tornadoes like we couldn't 30, 40 years ago. We now have Doppler radar, satellites, sophisticated measuring devices that can detect funnel clouds. Before, all we could detect were the big tornadoes that we knew hit F3 larger. And it turns out that of those large tornadoes, they are down dramatically since the 1950s, since the 1970s. So tornadoes are completely failing to cooperate. And it goes on. Floods and droughts and hurricanes, all of those factors are either declining or no trend on climate timescales. And it's just inconvenient truth like that. Over 1,200 footnotes in the book, citations of peer-reviewed literature. I go through a whole section on indoctrinating children as well. Any parent out there with kids from kindergarten through college, your kids are being indoctrinated. They're being told there's no debate. They're being told that climate skeptics are equivalent to climate deniers. Holocaust deniers is the implication. And this book is written as a reference book, A to Z, and it's a very humorous book. I have all kinds of wacky stuff. How global warming created Hitler, global warming saved Hitler. I get into all the finances, carbon taxes, the redistribution of wealth, the whole UN agenda. You'll find out what the UN is really up to, and they even admit it's not about climate or environmental policy. It's about redistributing wealth and global governance.
Who would have thunk, huh? So the way they describe it, it's like if this is imminent. I read also, Mark, that the hurricane situation in Florida also been greatly over-exaggerated from, I think it was 1900 to 1960. There were 65 major hurricanes in the U.S. that hit the U.S. East Coast. And yet, from 60 onward, there were 2/3 less severe hurricanes. So that isn't exactly...
the big hurricanes, yes.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, once again, we can count a lot of hurricanes over the Atlantic that we couldn't have counted 100 years ago. If a hurricane didn't make landfall, you had to go by ship's records, anecdotal sites, and grazing an island. And so there's just no way you had records. And the idea of things being unprecedented, now we have monitoring devices you can insert right into the center of the we weren't able to do all that. So the idea that, this is unprecedented, most of these records of unprecedented low pressure systems, all that, but it would have started, I believe, the late 1970s when they would have had that technology to even measure the sort of the pressure and how strong they are. But the idea that anything unusual is going on with hurricanes when the 40s and 50s were the most severe decade, and the large hurricanes, as you just mentioned, Kerry, are in decline. So, but yeah, you can say, just like tornadoes, there's more hurricanes than ever. That's because we're monitoring and measuring them like we've never had. But you can't compare apples to oranges unless you're a climate change activist. Then apples and oranges are the same thing.
Apples, hey, they're both fruits, so that makes them the same, right? Well, it's one topic that I get blasted about is that I am a so-called climate change denier. And I don't deny that the climate's changing. I just question, can you attribute it to the behavior of man? We go back in history to the mini ice age and then the medieval warming period. How can that be? They weren't burning any greenhouse gases back then other than making fires in the fireplace. Was that what was causing it then?
Yeah, in fact, I spent a lot of time in the book on the medieval warm period. I show that in 1990, the first United Nations climate report had a chart showing the medieval warm period much warmer than current temperatures. That obviously couldn't fly. By a few reports later, the UN, they had completely erased their original chart and made it so the medieval warm period no longer existed. The Little Ice Age no longer existed. They made it a flat line through all those centuries, and they made the 20th century this huge uptick, what they called the hockey stick.
Yeah.
And this is how they get away with it. They literally had no problem revising the historical record. So I show that the medieval warm period used to be called the medieval climate optimum. Remember, this was the time of the Renaissance, when you had vineyards in England, when you had increased agricultural yields, when humanity thrived. Somehow they've turned warming into this deadly thing that we should be afraid of, when in fact life loves warmth. Medieval warm period, which the UN is on record as acknowledging was much warmer than current temperatures, was a time of great progress and advancement for human civilization and animal civilization. Obviously, there's winners and losers in any changes. So if we were to go into a significant warm period, the Earth would probably have less ice, but there's no indication that we are doing that. In fact, based on solar cycles and being the fact that we're overdue for the next ice age, many scientists are predicting a cooling coming and for centuries to come, and particularly Russian scientists.
Yeah, well, you can't trust anything they say because they're Russians, and Putin is just pulling their strings. You know, I live in Florida, and if I listen to the warmists here, basically within a few short years, Miami will be submerged underwater, and the entire state it won't just be a swamp any longer, because Florida's always been a swamp since it was started being developed in the early 1900s. But basically, life as we know it is going to cease to exist in Florida, third largest population. All of the coastal cities are going to be swamped, literally. The water level is going to rise. Where does this come from? And is there any basis in fact?
No. In fact, Al Gore has the image of Florida half underwater. And in Al Gore's sequel, he spent a lot of time in Miami. Doesn't really mention that the king tides caused the fish swimming in the street. He attributed it to man-made global warming. Well, it turns out Miami is what they call subsidence, which is actually sinking, which has nothing to do with the temperature or ice melting. It's the land is generally sinking. This is also true in other areas of the East Coast, like North Carolina and others. But the media and the actors don't like to point that out. They like to just make it look as though, this is the melting glaciers and sea level. But what Miami is actually doing the correct things. I mean, it's just about its adaptability. If your land is sinking, and it's very hard to prevent that, but all you can do is put up seawalls. You can put up all kinds of things that divert the water. Holland has done this. So any areas over time are going to have geologically shifting plates. But what they're failing, and the key here is sea level is not accelerating. And I go to great lengths. There's also multiple, I call them dueling data sets, both on sea level, on temperature, on a whole host of other issues, but particularly sea level, where they use satellite monitoring. They began that in 1994. And suddenly they had a new way, again, remember the apples and orange comparison, they had a new way of measuring it. And so they showed a much greater rise with the satellite. They got all excited and went with that. And then the tide gauges showed and still show no acceleration. In fact, they show a pause in recent years of actual, a stopping of global sea level rise. So in addition to the sea level with all these dueling temperatures, temperature has the same thing, except there the satellites show less warming than the land-based and surface data. So what they did there is they actually went back and adjusted the satellite data to get rid of the global warming pause. And in the sea level area, they're doing that as well. They're putting in adjustments in quotes to adjust it to show more sea level rise than would otherwise happen. And as the aforementioned sea level rise not rising as fast, they're now claiming that it's going into groundwater and that it'll come out eventually. In other words, the land ate the sea level rise. They have all kinds of theories, but they love to use storms. So for instance, Al Gore will use sea level scare to show Hurricane Sandy in New York. In his first film, he warned that, the 9/11, the World Trade Center built site would be underwater. Well, he meant over glacial ice melting and sustained period that New York City would be underwater eventually. Well, in his movie sequel, he claimed vindication because momentary flooding from Hurricane Sandy caused flooding in the 9/11 memorial. Well, that's not the same thing. A storm surge from one storm is not what he was referring to in his first film. So there's all kinds of trickery in the way they present the stuff, and I go into that in the book.
So let's talk about a couple of other things. The use or the manipulation of statistics by the NOAA Is that real, or is it just the deniers are just denying reality?
No, it's in fact, and there's a whistleblower from NOAA who talked a lot about this right before the UN Paris Agreement, which President Obama, by the way, bypassed the Senate. And I go into that, how they don't even use Senate ratification. There was an executive agreement. They rushed out this NOAA study saying the pause no longer existed. And NOAA is at the forefront of what you would call historical temperature revision. And what I mean by that is very simple, is they went back in the records. They first of all denied there was a global warming standstill in temperature from the late 90s through 2015 or so. They just denied it. They said it wasn't happening. Then they came up with about 60 plus excuses. And I have these all documented. Everything from Chinese coal use caused aerosols, which blocked out the sun, which is why warming isn't as much, to the oceans ate our global warming, to all these other excuses. Finally, they said, the hell with it. We're done giving excuses. We're done denying it. We're going to fix the records. They went back. NOAA went back in their record book and they erased the pause. They made some adjustments and they said, presto, it no longer exists. There is no pause. So now, if you're a climatological student, you go want to look at government websites, you can go back in time now. There is no pause in the data keeping. How do they get away with that? This would be like a company trying to get investors and had a 15-year loss of revenue and losing money. So they hire a new accountant. He comes in, redoes the old books, shows record profits. Suddenly they look like an attractive investment. That's what the climate community at NOAA has done. Boldly, they claim these are adjustments that needed to be made. They have all kinds of really technical sounding, legitimate sounding reasons. Well, we went back and we realized that our Arctic adjustments weren't correct, so we adjusted that, which then helped the overall influence of the temperature, and that erased the pause. This is what they do, but we know that it's part of their agenda. We know that a scientist is on record as saying we have to get rid of the medieval warm period, and we know that they never liked the global warming pause because they denied it and then came up with 60 plus excuses. So now they got rid of it. They also got rid of it in the satellite data as well. There's a thing called the RSS satellite, which is government run. They went back and they erased it in that as well by adjusting past temperatures. It would be kind of like if you went to a doctor your whole life and you had all your height and weight charts, and you didn't like your weight when you were in your late teens. So you go back to the doctor and he goes back and adjusts your height and weight back then to make it more, to make yourself less pudgy or overweight. Suddenly you're feeling good that you weren't an overweight teen, but meanwhile, you were, but now the records don't reflect it. So it's an amazing thing to watch because they're altering history and they're doing it with a scientific justification, but we know there's a political motive, and this is what now is being investigated by Congress.
So, Mark, I understand these statistics are subject to manipulation. It's been done for years already. Back in 2009, there was an incident called Climategate, and that's where all of these emails from various so-called climate change authorities were leaked to the public, and it showed that they were like getting rid of the hockey. They created the hockey stick. They were getting rid of the medieval warming period, and yet there are websites here that like Union of Concerned Scientists, and they say it's a manufactured controversy over emails stolen from the University of East Anglia's Climate Research Unit, generated a lot more heat than light. The email content being quoted does not indicate that climate data and research data have been compromised, etc. And I should mention there was a Climategate too, where more emails were leaked. And how do you respond to that?
Well, actually, I spent a whole chapter in the book on Climategate itself, and it was one of the most significant things because what it did is it revealed through these leaked or hacked, whatever you want to say, it's never actually been figured out, which is amazing when you think about that. Emails shows the top United Nations scientists colluding with each other to craft a narrative on global warming. In those emails, we find out that top UN scientists were threatening journal editors who, if they published papers that went against the United Nations narrative of climate alarm. We find out in these Climategate emails about the lamenting of these scientists from, for instance, solar scientists who weren't towing the line and believing that carbon dioxide was the control knob of the climate. We find out how they tried to overcome and to avoid any kind of what's that called? Oh, yeah, the Freedom of Information Act requests, where they were hiding and told each other to delete emails. We also, I point out in the book that they had several investigations which they claim exonerated, in quotes, the climate scientists. In reality, it was the global warming industry investigating the global warming industry without even a hint of watching out for conflict of interest. These were their colleagues investigating themselves, and in many cases, they started out with the premise of, we're not going to find anything here. We have to restore confidence to the public in the climate. So that was their goal going into it. So people who think, oh, well, weren't they exonerated? They'll be amazed to read this, because I go into all the details about the different investigations and how they were severely compromised. And I actually just put in some of the most outrageous quotes from the emails, which aren't in dispute. And people can decide for themselves if they agree with a Princeton scientist named, not Will Happer, but Steve Austin, who actually says in the thing that this was fraud, pure and simple, Climategate. So I leave it to the reader to decide that. But that is a very eye-opening chapter, because you get to see how the sausage is made, and you don't want to eat this sausage, and you don't want to swallow these climate claims when you see how they make it.
Well, it sounds like this is a great follow-up to your numerous other books, like Climate Hustle. I should say that's the movie that you made.
Yeah, the movie.
Right.
Yes, and I had a huge report, 1,000 dissenting scientists report, which I actually published the United States Senate Committee, and then later on my website, which was a big report showing all the scientists from around the world dissenting from the United Nations. But this book is out. It's Regnery Publishing, part of their Politically Incorrect Guide series. It's available Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and we have a discount deal at climatedepot.com. If you go there, again, no parent would want to be without this. It's the ultimate reference book on climate.
All right. Well, hey, it's a real interesting hearing it from the other side, the other perspective. And I'm relieved that the polar bears are going to survive at least another year, another summer in the rapidly warming Arctic waters. And, it just befoggles the mind that all of this is out there, Mark. Everything you've said is out there. People read it and they just discard it. And look, we can't even predict what the weather is going to be tomorrow with any degree of certainty. But that's weather. That's not climate. What's the difference here between weather and climate? And why should we be suspicious of people who can't predict the weather for the next week, but are predicting climate for the next century? There's something amiss here.
Yeah, there is. There always is. Well, first of all, just in general, climate is long-term, essentially long-term weather trends. Usually you want at least 30 years of data to be considered climate. And of course, weather is everything from day to day, week to week, month to month, even seasonal. But yeah, that's one of the big things. And I point that out with meteorologists in this, long range forecasting might be months out, maybe up to a year, depending. You have expert long range forecasters like meteorologist Joe Bastardi and a few others. But climate is a totally different ball game. And they claim they can know with certainty 100 years out, 75 years out. And one of my favorite quotes in the book is Penn State Climategate professor Michael Mann, who admits finally, well, we won't know if any of these predictions long term are real until the time comes and we see if they happen. And that's what I point out in the book is the people making these predictions will be long dead by the time we can find out whether they were accurate or not. But we don't even have to wait, because I actually go in the book and show you predictions they made back in the 80s and 90s have spectacularly failed. And of course, one of the refrains then is, well, the science is much better now. Well, first of all, science is always better as you go forward in the future, but it doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make your predictions any less inaccurate. And that's one of the funny things when you go forward. I actually spent a lot of time, too, in the history of the carbon dioxide scare, going back to the original Swedish professor and some of his other wacky theories, and going back to the 19th century on that. And so I think people will be surprised to find that even in, like, say, 19th century world, the Aborigines in Australia blame bad weather on the introduction of the white man. So there's always been a superstition about what causes weather changes. And I go to the history of witchcraft. One of my favorite quotes is Princeton professor Will Happer, says that not much has changed since the Salem witch trials, that everyone accused witches of changing the weather and crop failure, much like they do our SUVs today. And he said they were condemned and by judges that were largely educated at Harvard University. Not much has changed, because now you have all the academia out there promoting essentially medieval witchcraft. Instead of witches being weather machines, our SUVs and our home thermostats are now the new weather machines and the new superstition.
And one final thing, I thought all this was settled science. Why are we still having this debate? We're relitigating what's already been proven by the scientific community. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, in fact, in the book, I point out when they did the UN Paris Agreement 2015 December, I announced at the time, like, okay, because they were all saying it's done, we've solved it, we can now move on. This is we've done this, our grandchildren will thank us. Then it's like, great, we've solved the problem. Let's cut the funding. Let's stop all the scientific, all the millions and tens of millions of dollars and billions that go to all this industry and study and monitoring and all these fear scenarios. But of course, no one was interested in that. The debate was never over. They had to keep coming, and and by the way, the UN Paris Agreement, even if we'd stayed in it, was not over. Every year they have a major UN meeting, and then they have a bunch of minor meetings, and it's all designed to keep ratcheting up those commitments. So whatever you think the agreement is now, people will say, oh, it's all voluntary. It doesn't. Within 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, every year they're increasing the requirements. So it's part of getting the camel's nose in the tent. And that's what they're trying to do here. And that's why what Donald Trump did was so courageous, to get us out of that UN Paris Agreement before they continue to ratchet it up. The big question remains to be seen is Donald Trump's presidency a blip in climate policy, or is it a sea change? Will it be a change? In other words, if a Democrat wins next time, or a weak Republican is the next president, then all this can be reversed, because they're mostly executive orders, because that's Obama bypassed democracy. He achieved most of this through executive orders, but they could be put right back in because the courts don't seem to have a problem. And our Supreme Court doesn't have a problem regulating what we exhale from our mouth as a toxic pollutant, carbon dioxide. And they don't seem to have a problem, allowing the U.S., not having the U.S. Senate ratify treaties, which has been their traditional role. We did it with the Rio Earth Summit. We would have had to do it with the UN Kyoto Protocol. But for some reason, the UN Paris Agreement, we were post-constitutional. Obama just decided we don't need no stinking democracy. We're going to just go ahead and abide by this as an, quote, executive agreement. And that's what they did, and the courts had no problem with it.
Yeah. Well, it's all really fascinating to see how this thing has been created and to see how it's being disseminated. California is like marching ahead like it's not even part of the United States, implementing all sorts of cap and trade policies and market for carbon credits. And I always laugh when I'm on an airline's website and they're allowing me to do a carbon offset, but they're charging me for this thing. It's like, come on, like air travel, we're getting ripped off as it is. Why do I have to spend more money to offset something that, well, look at California going back to worry about cow flatulence. I guess if I spend the $15 more on the flight, I'll kind of cancel out a couple of cows.
Yeah, and I also point out, this is a movement that's trying to regulate everything from our light bulbs to our home appliances, to our diet, to our agriculture, to our transportation, to the size of our homes, to our national sovereignty, to our energy economy, to every aspect of our lives. And you mentioned cows. Well, it's cow flatulence. That's why they're pushing vegetarianism. They're pushing insects. There's actually a man, I profile, NYU professor in the book, who wants to have people have people have the nicotine patch. They don't smoke. They want to have a patch that makes eating meat unpleasant experience, so people stop eating meat to stop global warming. And that is a huge issue. They say that cow emissions and agricultural emissions contribute more to global warming than all of the transportation sector combined of trains, planes, automobiles. So they're coming after our diet. That's one of the things. This is why when I interviewed the UN climate chief, she actually stated that seeking a centralized transformation that will make life on planet Earth very different for everyone. Does that sound like something we all want? But that's what their goal is. That's what John Kerry, President Obama, Mitt Romney all want to sign us up to. Mitt Romney urged President Trump not to get out of the UN Paris Agreement. And believe me, John McCain wouldn't have got out. Most Republicans, I'm going to use the word, are corrupt on this issue. They are terrified of standing up to the political correctness. They're terrified of standing up to the UN. They're terrified of standing up to the media. They would have gone along with this.
Mm-hmm. Remarkable. And it's all out there. You can do the research. And then the other thing, finally, Mark, is the vitriol, the attacks that you receive. It should be a scientific discussion. After all, you're dealing with scientists on this point. And yet it always comes down to, well, you're a denier, which is basically, you're like going back to the time of Galileo and saying that the earth is flat and the sun revolves around the earth. And, I can see you having to go to the Vatican and admit that there's climate change, but then saying, oh, but it does.
Well, it's funny you should say that. In the book, I talk about my trek to the Vatican at the UN, at the Vatican Climate Summit in April 2015. And how do you think I was received? I was threatened by armed guards that I'd be thrown out of my ear when I tried to ask a question to the UN. I call it the unholy alliance between Pope Francis and the United Nations. So I actually, I'm going to sound ridiculous now. I can relate to Galileo. I was threatened and thrown out of the Vatican when I went to try to tell them the truth about global warming. Now I'm being silly, but that did happen, and I detail that in the book. I did go to the Vatican. I went to the climate summit, and armed Vatican security threatened to throw me out of the meeting because I was trying to ask a question of Ban Ki-moon at the time, the UN chief, about climate change.
Hey, and you got to be careful. Those guards at the Vatican, they're all Swiss. They're like multi-generational. They're supposed to be like the most vicious guards on the planet. We're really happy that you made it out of there alive, Mark. Mark, so we find you at climatedepot.com. We find
climatedepot.com, and the book is Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, available wherever fine books are sold, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. You can get Kindle audio versions. It's a major publisher. It's a major release, and it's #1 in climatology, earth and sciences. I'm trying to get it up higher and higher here. This is again, it's an entertaining read. I took everything Al Gore taught me from watching his movies, and I did the opposite. It's not boring. It's not technical. It's not dry. Trust me, this is wacky stuff.
This is what happens when you take on the deep state, when you take on the orthodoxy. You will become a target, and a target of hate. I mean, the most nasty emails you could ever imagine, Mark, come to me when I discuss this. And they don't so much attack me because I'm just the messenger, let's face it, but they attack the guest with words that you just, if my kids had said those words when they were growing up, man, they would be, basically downing a whole bar of soap. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
So in any event, hey, if you're interested in what Mark had to say or anyone else you heard on the show, be a part of it. Send us your email, kl@kerrylutz.com. The Twitter feed is @KerryLutz, and the Facebook page is Financial Survival Network. Mark, wish you the best of luck. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you, Kerry. Appreciate it.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.